immediately! Ken!
Joyce!
This bridge belongs to Willow Bend!
Not anymore!
Look at this survey. This proves the county line is here.
That binder says otherwise, Mr. Walker.
But the historical deeds are clear. We need to follow the law.
My board disagrees.
The steel lock snapped shut on the bridge gate at 6:08 in the morning, and the first HOA SUV slammed its brakes before sunrise even cleared the ridge. Karen Mitchell jumped out behind it, pointing at the chain across what she called their only community bridge. My bridge. My gate. My access road. Within minutes, 20 cars backed up along the gravel road, headlights shining across the creek, engines idling while kids missed school buses and contractors sat trapped behind the HOA entrance. What Karen did not know was that I controlled the bridge deck, the maintenance easement, the inspection gate, and both concrete abutments underneath her entire neighborhood's access route. Then the old bridge groaned under the weight of a delivery truck trying to inch forward. The sound rolled through the morning air like a warning. Metal flexed. Gravel popped under tires. Mist lifted from the creek below. I stood beside the gate with a thermos in one hand and the survey map folded under my arm, watching Karen's face turn red in the cold. That was her first mistake. She thought I had blocked her neighborhood. I had not. I had blocked an unsafe bridge sitting on land I had just bought. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 43 years old, and I buy neglected rural land for a living. Timber parcels. Old cattle ground. Forgotten acreage outside growing subdivisions. 3 weeks earlier, I closed on 6,000 acres of ridge, creek bottom, and pine forest outside Willow Bend Estates. The land wrapped around the HOA like a horseshoe. I bought it for conservation, timber recovery, and long-term development control. I did not buy it to start a war before breakfast. But the bridge changed that. It was old, narrow, steel frame, timber decking, 1 lane wide. It crossed Millstone Creek and connected the HOA's private road to the county highway. For years, residents drove over it without thinking. School buses, garbage trucks, propane deliveries, landscapers, moving vans. Nobody looked down. Nobody checked who owned it. Nobody asked who maintained it. Then I found the bridge gate during my first property walkthrough. Rusted hinges, bent chain, no lock, a faded metal sign half swallowed. By Vine said maintenance access only. Below it, a newer HOA sign said Willow Bend Residence Entrance. That bothered me. 2 signs, 2 different stories. So I called a surveyor. Then I called a bridge inspector. The inspector came the next morning. He tapped the deck with a steel hammer and listened to the sound like a doctor listening to a lung. Hollow in 3 places. Soft at the edges. Corrosion near the southern bearing plate. He did not overreact. Professionals rarely do. He simply looked at me and said, I would restrict heavy traffic until this is reviewed. So I did exactly that. I installed a temporary lock and posted a safety notice at dawn. That was when Karen arrived in her pearl white Cadillac, wearing a navy blazer and the expression of someone used to being obeyed. She walked straight past the safety notice. She did not read it. She did not look at the creek. She looked at the chain. Remove that immediately, she said. Her voice carried over the idling cars. This bridge belongs to Willow Bend. I unfolded the survey map. The paper snapped in the wind. No, I said. It does not. The line of cars went quiet. Even the creek seemed louder. Karen stepped closer, perfume cutting through the smell of wet timber and exhaust. You bought land outside the HOA, she said. You did not buy our infrastructure. I looked past her at the bridge deck. Another truck crept forward, and the boards gave a low wooden crack. Karen did not even turn around. That told me everything. She cared more about control than the structure carrying her entire neighborhood. Then my phone buzzed with the county engineer's number. The phone vibrated again before I could answer. Karen noticed the county seal on the screen and folded her arms. The line of vehicles behind her stretched farther down the gravel road now. A school bus sat near the back. Parents stepped out of trucks and SUVs. Cold air carried the smell of wet leaves and diesel exhaust across the creek. I answered the call. The county engineer did not waste time. His voice sounded calm, almost too calm. Mr. Walker, I pulled the archived files you requested. I looked at the bridge. A gust of wind rattled the chain against the gate. And I asked. Papers shuffled on the other end. Then he said something that made me look up from the survey map. The ownership issue is only part of it. Karen watched my face carefully. She was trying to read the conversation without hearing it. The engineer continued. I found the original subdivision access documents from 22 years ago. There is a missing transfer. A delivery truck idled near the bridge entrance. The driver leaned out his window. Nobody moved. Nobody crossed. Missing transfer? I asked. The bridge was supposed to be conveyed during final development approval. According to county records, that never happened. I glanced toward Karen. She was already speaking into her own phone. Fast. Frustrated. The engineer lowered his voice. There is another detail. My grip tightened on the phone. The creek flowed beneath the bridge with a steady rush. What detail? I asked. The maintenance responsibility remained attached to the original parcel. For a moment, all I heard was water moving under steel. Then the meaning landed. The original parcel was now part of the 6,000 acres I had purchased. The engineer was telling me something far bigger than simple ownership. Karen stepped closer. Who are you talking to? She demanded. I held up a finger and listened. The county never received proof of transfer, the engineer said. Legally, the responsibility may still follow the land. A contractor farther back in the traffic line honked his horn. Another driver joined in. The sound echoed through the valley. Karen turned toward the vehicles and raised both hands, trying to calm people down. It did not work. More residents were arriving. More questions were spreading. I thanked the engineer and ended the call. The screen went dark. The morning sun finally cleared the ridge and threw pale gold light across the bridge deck. Every crack in the weathered timber became visible. Every rust stain stood out. Karen walked directly toward me. Open the gate. Her voice was sharper now. Not until the inspection is complete. She laughed once. Short and cold. You bought acreage outside our neighborhood. You do not control our entrance. I unfolded the survey map again. The paper snapped in the wind. Several residents gathered close enough to see the boundary lines. One older man adjusted his glasses. A woman beside him leaned forward. Karen noticed their attention and immediately changed her tone. That caught my attention. People only change tactics when the first one fails. This can be handled privately, she said. There is no reason to create confusion. Confusion. The word hung in the air. Behind her, dozens of residents were staring at the bridge that carried every vehicle into their community. Nobody looked confused anymore. They looked concerned. Then one resident pointed toward the county parcel number printed across my map. And everything started changing. The resident stepped closer and squinted at the parcel number printed across the bottom corner of the map. He pointed directly at it. That is County Parcel 74, he said. A few heads turned immediately. The man looked familiar with the area. Maybe a longtime resident. Maybe someone who had followed development plans years ago. Karen reacted before anyone else could speak. That map is irrelevant. Her answer came too fast. Too sharp. The resident frowned. No, it is not. The line of vehicles behind her had stopped growing. Now people were getting out and walking forward. Curiosity had replaced impatience. The morning sun climbed higher above the ridge. Frost melted from the bridge railing and dripped into the creek below. The smell of wet timber lingered in the air. Karen stepped between the map and the crowd. This is a private HOA matter. Several residents exchanged looks. That statement had the opposite effect she intended. More people moved closer. Nobody likes being told to stop asking questions, especially when they use the same road every day. I unfolded the map completely across the hood of my truck. The paper stretched nearly 3 feet wide. Survey lines crossed the property like veins. The bridge sat right in the center. The county parcel number matched exactly. A woman in a red coat leaned forward. Wait, she said. The bridge is actually on your land? Before I could answer, Karen interrupted. Again, ownership has never been disputed. That statement caught my attention. Never been disputed. Not never owned. Not always HOA property. Her wording landed carefully. Too carefully. Another small detail. Another piece of the puzzle. The older resident pointed again. Then why is the parcel number his? Silence followed. Just for a second. But it was enough. The creek flowed beneath us. Wind rustled through pine trees along the bank. Somewhere farther down the road, a dog barked. Karen glanced toward the neighborhood entrance as if looking for an escape route. Then she changed direction entirely. Open the gate, and we will discuss paperwork later. There it was. Not denial. Not proof. Delay. I had seen that strategy before in business negotiations. Push the decision forward. Regain control later. Keep people moving. Keep them from looking too closely. My phone buzzed again. This time it was the surveyor who had mapped the property boundaries. I answered. His truck was already on the way. He estimated 20 minutes. I thanked him and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Karen heard enough to understand someone else was coming. Her expression tightened. That was another clue. A contractor standing near the front of the traffic line finally spoke up. If the surveyor is coming, why not wait? Several residents nodded. Karen did not. The bridge groaned again as a gust of wind pushed through the steel trusses. Everyone heard it. Heads turned instinctively. The sound echoed over the creek. Suddenly the structure felt older, more fragile, more important. I walked to the gate and rested a hand on the cold chain. Rust stained the links orange and brown. The inspection stays in place, I said, until I know exactly what I own and exactly what condition it is in. Nobody argued with the safety part, not even Karen. She argued with everything else. That told me something too. Then a black county pickup appeared at the far end of the road and started driving toward the bridge. The black county pickup rolled slowly through the line of waiting vehicles and stopped beside the bridge gate. Gravel crackled under the tires. Every conversation around us seemed to fade at once. The driver stepped out carrying a hard case and a stack of rolled documents. It was the surveyor, Mark Reynolds. I had worked with him before. He was the kind of professional who trusted measurements more than opinions. That made him dangerous to anyone relying on assumptions. Karen recognized him immediately. Her expression tightened. Mark nodded to me, then looked at the bridge. Quite a crowd for a survey check, he said. A few residents laughed nervously. Nobody left. Mark opened the hard case on the hood of his truck. Inside sat a tablet, property maps, and several laminated plats. The morning sun reflected off the screen. He tapped through a series of files while people gathered closer. Karen folded her arms. This is unnecessary. Mark did not even look up. The county disagrees. That answer landed harder than any argument. A small murmur moved through the crowd. The creek continued rushing beneath the bridge. Wind rattled loose branches overhead. Mark finally turned the tablet around. The map filled the screen. Colored boundary lines crossed the landscape. The bridge sat directly inside the parcel I had purchased. Not on the edge. Not partially overlapping. Directly inside it. Several residents leaned forward. One man removed his sunglasses and stared at the display. Another resident pulled out a phone and took a picture. Karen immediately objected. Digital maps can be wrong. Mark nodded calmly, which is why I brought the original recorded survey. He unrolled a large sheet across the truck hood. The paper snapped in the breeze. Signatures covered the bottom corner. County stamps filled the margins. Dates stretched back decades. The crowd grew quieter. Even Karen stopped talking for a moment. That silence told its own story. Mark pointed to a survey marker symbol near the bridge entrance. We verified this monument yesterday. Then he pointed to another. And this one. His finger traced the line connecting them. The bridge remained entirely within my property boundary. There was no ambiguity. No missing corner. No disputed line. Just facts. A resident near the front frowned. Then why did everyone think the HOA owned it? Nobody answered. Immediately, that question lingered in the air. It was the question everyone suddenly wanted answered. Karen looked away toward the neighborhood entrance. Mark began rolling up the survey again. Then he paused. Actually, there is something else. Every head turned back toward him. The sound of the creek seemed louder again. Mark pulled another document from the case. Older paper. Yellowed edges. Different stamps. While reviewing the parcel history, I found references to a maintenance agreement. Karen moved instantly. Too instantly. That document is irrelevant. Mark looked at her for the first time all morning. I have not even explained it yet. Several residents exchanged glances. Another small crack appeared in the story they had been told. Mark placed the document on the hood. The agreement required periodic structural reviews and maintenance reporting. He tapped a paragraph near the center. I have not found evidence those reports were ever filed. A contractor standing near the bridge whistled quietly. The bridge groaned again as wind pushed through the steel frame. This time, everyone noticed. People looked up at the structure carrying every vehicle into the neighborhood. Not just as a road. As a responsibility. Karen reached for her phone. She stepped away from the crowd and started making another call. Fast. Urgent. The kind of call people make when control begins slipping away. Then Mark looked directly at me. You need to see what is attached to the next file. Mark slid the second document across the hood of the truck. The paper looked older than everything else he had shown that morning. Yellow edges, faded ink, county stamps barely visible beneath decades of handling. Residents pressed closer. Even the people still sitting in their vehicles were watching now. Karen ended her phone call and immediately started walking back toward us. Her pace quickened when she saw the document. That alone made me pay attention. Mark pointed to a section near the bottom. This agreement was attached to the original subdivision approval package. The wind fluttered the corner of the page. He held it down with one hand. It established maintenance obligations for the access structure and adjoining corridor. The older resident who had recognized the parcel number adjusted his glasses again. What does that mean? Mark looked up. It means someone was supposed to inspect, document, and report structural conditions on a regular basis. A contractor standing nearby folded his arms. And were they? Mark shook his head. The answer came without drama. Just facts. Somehow that made it heavier. The creek flowed beneath the bridge. Water brushed against the concrete supports with a steady rhythm. A school bus driver leaned against his door and listened. Nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. This had become bigger than a traffic delay. Karen stepped beside the truck. Those records are incomplete. Mark remained calm. Possibly. Then he tapped the paper again. But this section is complete. His finger rested on a signature block. Several signatures appeared across the bottom. One belonged to the original developer. Another belonged to a county official. A third signature was harder to read. Karen looked away before anyone else did. Another detail. Another reaction. The older resident noticed it too. I could tell by the way he watched her. Mark opened another file on his tablet. I spent most of last night reviewing archived county material. He zoomed into a scanned document. This agreement appears repeatedly over several years. A woman near the front asked the question everyone was thinking. Then who was responsible? Mark glanced at me. Based on what I have found so far, responsibility followed the parent parcel until a valid transfer occurred. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence that morning. Vehicles idled. Birds moved through the trees. Somewhere down the creek, a branch cracked. Nobody spoke. The implication was becoming clear. Not just ownership, responsibility, liability, maintenance, inspection. The bridge was no longer just a crossing. It was an asset with obligations attached to it. Karen finally broke the silence. You are presenting theories. Mark nodded. That is why I said so far. He never raised his voice. He never argued. Facts were doing all the work for him. Then he reached into the hard case again. This time he pulled out a thin folder with a red county archive label across the front. His expression changed slightly. Not dramatic. Just enough for me to notice. This is the part one did not expect to find. Several residents stepped even closer. Phones appeared. People started recording. Karen saw that and immediately looked uncomfortable. Mark opened the folder. Inside were copies of meeting correspondence, letters, notices, internal communications. Dates from years ago covered the pages. The first page contained a highlighted sentence. Mark read it aloud. Access structure ownership remains unresolved pending documentation review. A murmur moved through the crowd. Karen's jaw tightened. The sentence had been written nearly 18 years earlier. Not last month. Not recently. 18 years. The older resident slowly shook his head. Someone knew. Nobody answered him. Nobody had to. The question was no longer whether there was a problem. The question was who knew about it and when. Then Mark turned to the next page, and his expression became even more serious. Mark turned the page slowly. The crowd leaned in as if the paper itself might answer every question. The creek moved beneath the bridge with a steady rush. Sunlight reflected off the water and flashed against the steel beams. Mark placed one finger on a dated letter near the center of the page. This correspondence was sent 17 years ago. His voice remained calm. That made people listen even harder. Karen crossed her arms and stared at the document without speaking. The letter had been addressed to the original HOA board. Several names appeared beneath the heading. Most were long gone from the neighborhood. One name, however, was familiar. A resident near the front recognized it immediately. That was Karen's predecessor. A murmur spread through the crowd. Mark nodded. According to this letter, county officials requested clarification regarding ownership and maintenance responsibility. He flipped to the next page. Another letter. Another request. Another reminder. The dates stretched across several years. Nobody seemed eager to answer those requests. That pattern became impossible to ignore. A woman standing beside the school bus shook her head. So this issue never disappeared? Mark looked at her. Apparently not. The wind pushed through the bridge trusses again. A low metallic hum drifted across the creek. Several people glanced upward. The structure suddenly felt less permanent than it had an hour earlier. Karen finally spoke. Those letters do not prove anything. Her voice sounded measured, but something had changed. The confidence from earlier that morning was fading. Mark did not argue. He simply opened another document. That had become his strategy. Let the records speak. This is a meeting summary from 14 years ago. He adjusted the page so everyone could see it. A highlighted paragraph sat near the bottom. The older resident read it aloud before Mark could. Access structure ownership remains unresolved. Further review recommended. Silence followed. Even Karen did not interrupt. More residents pulled out phones. Some took pictures. Others recorded video. Information was spreading now. Fast. A contractor standing near the bridge railing let out a slow whistle. 14 years. Nobody corrected him. The number hung in the air. 14 years. 14 years of uncertainty. 14 years of unanswered questions. 14 years of vehicles crossing the same structure every day. I watched Karen carefully. She was no longer focused on me. She was watching the residents. That told me where the real pressure was coming from. Not the survey. Not the county. Not even the bridge itself. The people. They were beginning to ask questions she could not easily dismiss. Then Mark pulled out the final document from the archive folder. This one was different. Thicker paper. County engineering stamp. Structural review reference number. His expression tightened slightly. Another detail. Another warning. What is that? Someone asked. Mark glanced toward the bridge. An engineering recommendation. The crowd grew quiet again. He opened the document. Several pages contained inspection notes, photographs, and maintenance observations. Most of the terminology meant little to the average resident. One sentence did. Not. Mark tapped it with his finger. Recommended comprehensive structural review within 5 years. The date sat beside it. 12 years old. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from water moving below us and wind brushing through pine trees. Then a resident near the back asked the question everyone was suddenly thinking. Did anyone ever do that review? Mark slowly closed the folder. I have not found evidence that they did. The reaction was immediate. Concern replaced curiosity. Concern felt heavier. More personal. People were no longer discussing property lines. They were thinking about school buses, families, emergency vehicles, daily traffic. Karen reached for her phone again. This time her hand trembled slightly. Very few people noticed. I did. Then Mark looked directly at me and lowered his voice. The county archive is not the only place records exist. Mark's words stayed with me even after the conversation around us started again. The county archive was not the only place records existed. That meant someone else might be holding pieces of the story. The crowd had shifted from frustration to investigation. Residents were no longer asking when the gate would reopen. They were asking what had happened over the last 20 years. Karen knew it too. She stood near the edge of the gathering, speaking quietly into her phone while keeping one eye on the documents spread across the truck hood. The morning had become brighter. Sunlight reflected off windshields and flashed across the steel frame above the creek. The bridge seemed to dominate every conversation. Mark closed the archive folder and lowered his voice. There is one person you should talk to. That immediately caught my attention. A mini hook settled over the moment. Who? I asked. Mark glanced toward the neighborhood entrance before answering. The original project engineer is still alive. Several residents overheard him. Heads turned. Karen looked up so quickly that she nearly dropped her phone. Another detail. Another reaction. Mark continued. He retired years ago. Lives about 30 miles from here. The older resident adjusted his glasses again. Would he remember? Something this old? Mark shrugged. Engineers remember bridges. A few people smiled at that. Then the smiles disappeared, because everyone realized he was probably right. The bridge groaned softly as a breeze moved through the trusses. The sound seemed louder now that people were paying attention. A woman near the front folded her arms. If someone knew there were unresolved questions, why were residents never told? No one answered. Karen certainly did not. She stared at the creek instead. The contractor beside me shook his head. That is a fair question. More residents nodded. The pressure was shifting. Earlier that morning, I had been the focus. Now attention was moving elsewhere. Mark packed away several documents, but left the archive folder visible. Almost intentionally. There is another thing, he said. Conversation stopped again. He pointed toward a note attached to the engineering recommendation. The paper fluttered in the breeze. This reference number corresponds to a private consultant. I leaned closer. Meaning? Mark tapped the page. Meaning someone may have ordered additional evaluations outside county records. The crowd became quiet. Very quiet. Wind moved through the trees along the creek bank. A bird landed on the bridge railing and immediately flew away. Even small sounds seemed sharper. If private evaluations existed, they could answer questions the county could not. They could also explain why certain people appeared nervous. Karen suddenly stepped forward. This speculation is accomplishing nothing. Her voice carried across the gathering. Several residents looked at her. Nobody moved. Nobody agreed. That was new. Earlier she controlled every conversation. Now she was struggling to redirect even one. The older resident spoke before anyone else could. If there are more records, we should see them. A woman beside him agreed immediately. Then another resident. Then another. The mood was changing. Slowly, but unmistakably. Karen realized it too. Her expression hardened. She turned and walked several steps away from the crowd. Not toward the bridge. Not toward the documents. Toward her vehicle. I watched her open the passenger door and reach for something inside. A thick binder. She froze when she noticed people watching. Then she closed the door halfway and stood there for a moment. Thinking. Calculating. The binder remained visible through the open gap. Mark followed my gaze. So did several residents. Nobody said a word. Sometimes silence reveals more than questions. The creek continued rushing beneath us. Sunlight glinted across the water. Somewhere down the road, another vehicle arrived and joined the growing line. The driver stepped out and immediately started asking what was happening. Before anyone could answer, Karen picked up the binder and started walking back toward the crowd. Karen walked back toward us holding the binder against her side. Every conversation around the bridge seemed to pause. The crowd had grown larger. Some residents stood beside their vehicles. Others sat on folding chairs pulled from truck beds. Nobody wanted to leave. The bridge was no longer just a road crossing. It had become the center of the entire neighborhood. Sunlight reflected off the creek below. The smell of damp pine drifted through the cold air. Karen stopped beside the truck hood where the documents were spread out. For a moment she said nothing. Then she placed the binder down carefully. "These are HOA records," she said. Several residents immediately leaned forward. The older man who had recognized the parcel number moved closer than anyone else. Karen kept one hand on the binder, almost protectively. Mark noticed it too. "Do they address the bridge?" he asked. Karen hesitated. Not long, but long enough. Then she opened the cover. Inside sat years of meeting minutes, maintenance budgets, project summaries, and correspondence. Tabs divided everything by date. The binder looked organized. Too organized. A mini hook settled over the crowd again. People sensed there was something important inside. Karen flipped through several sections before stopping near the middle. The HOA has always maintained this access route. She held up a page. A landscaping contract. Snow removal records. Pavement repairs. Residents nodded. They recognized some of the vendors listed there. At first glance, the documents seemed convincing. Then Mark asked a simple question. "Where are the bridge inspections?" Karen froze for a fraction of a second. It happened so quickly most people missed it. I did not. She turned another page. Then another. Then another. The sound of paper flipping became the only thing anyone heard. The answer never appeared. The contractor standing beside me folded his arms. "Good question." More pages turned. More silence followed. Finally, Karen closed the binder. Not every document was preserved. A murmur rolled through the crowd. The explanation sounded weak, especially after seeing how organized everything else appeared. Mark remained calm. "You have snow removal records from 16 years ago." Nobody laughed. Nobody needed to. The point landed on its own. Karen looked frustrated now. The kind of frustration that appears when a prepared explanation stops working. Then the older resident stepped forward. "Can I see the binder?" Karen immediately pulled it closer. Another reaction. Another clue. Residents noticed. I could see it in their faces. Questions were multiplying faster than answers. Wind rattled through the bridge trusses overhead. The steel frame answered with a low metallic hum. Everyone looked up for a moment. Then attention returned to the binder. A woman standing near the school bus pointed toward one of the visible tabs. "What is that section?" Karen glanced down before answering. "Executive correspondence." The phrase caught everyone's attention. Even Mark raised an eyebrow. "Correspondence with whom?" he asked. Karen did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened the section. Several letters appeared. Meeting summaries. Internal discussions. Consultant references. Most of the pages remained partially hidden beneath her hand. Then a loose sheet slipped free and fluttered onto the truck hood. Nobody moved. Nobody needed to. The page landed face up. A date near the top immediately stood out. 12 years earlier. Mark reached toward it. Karen reached too. For a second, both hands stopped. The crowd noticed. The older resident noticed. I noticed. Then Karen slowly pulled her hand back. Mark picked up the page and scanned the contents. His expression changed almost instantly. Not shock. Recognition. As if he had just found something that connected several pieces at once. He read one sentence silently. Then he read it again. The creek rushed beneath the bridge. A truck engine idled somewhere down the road. Every resident waited. Then Mark looked directly at Karen and asked a question she clearly did not want to hear. Mark held the page in both hands and looked directly at Karen. The crowd became so quiet that I could hear water moving around rocks beneath the bridge. Even the school bus engine seemed distant now. Karen stood perfectly still beside the truck. The binder remained open in front of her. Mark tapped the loose sheet once. Why does this mention a structural review that was never filed with the county? Nobody spoke. Several residents exchanged confused looks. Karen's expression tightened. She glanced at the document, then at the people surrounding her. The question hung in the cold air. A mini hoax settled over the crowd. Everyone knew the answer mattered. Karen finally cleared her throat. I have never seen that page before. The response landed badly. Too many people had already watched the paper fall from her own binder. The older resident frowned immediately. A contractor beside the bridge railing shook his head. Mark remained calm. The review reference number matches the engineering recommendation from 12 years ago. He held up both documents side by side. Same project number. Same bridge. The creek rushed beneath us. Wind moved through the pine trees. Nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. A woman standing near the front crossed her arms. So there was another inspection? Mark nodded slowly. It appears there may have been. Karen looked frustrated now. Not angry. Not confident. Frustrated. That difference mattered. The crowd could see it. Mark lowered the page onto the truck hood and read part of the text aloud. Additional evaluation recommended due to unresolved ownership and maintenance concerns. Several residents repeated the last phrase quietly. Unresolved ownership. Maintenance concerns. The words spread through the gathering faster than any rumor. A man, near the back, pulled out his phone and started searching old HOA meeting records online. Others followed. The bridge groaned softly overhead. Every sound from the structure seemed magnified now. It was no longer invisible. People were paying attention to it for the first time in years. Karen pointed toward me. None of this changes the fact that he shut down access. The attempt to redirect attention lasted only a moment. A resident answered before I could. Because an inspector recommended restrictions. Another resident nodded. Then another. The conversation was slipping away from her. Mark flipped the page over. Handwritten notes covered the back. That immediately caught his attention. He leaned closer. The crowd leaned closer with him. The handwriting was faded but readable. Dates appeared beside several entries. Phone calls. Follow-up requests. Consultant references. Then Mark stopped on one line and stared at it for several seconds. I noticed. So did everyone else. What is it? The older resident asked. Mark exhaled slowly. This note references a meeting with the original project engineer. The same engineer he had mentioned earlier. The one who was still alive. The crowd reacted immediately. Several people began talking at once. Karen did not. Her silence stood out. Mark continued reading. Engineer advised retaining documentation regarding bridge ownership status. Another pause. Documentation retained in private project archive. That sentence changed everything. The county files were incomplete. The HOA records were incomplete. But somewhere else, another archive existed. A private archive, potentially containing every missing piece. The contractor let out a low whistle. The woman near the school bus looked directly at Karen. Did the board know about this? Karen opened her mouth, then stopped. For the first time all morning, She seemed unsure which answer would help her. The wind lifted several pages inside the binder. Paper fluttered across the hood of the truck. Mark caught them before they blew away. One page revealed a list of former board members. Another showed meeting dates going back nearly 2 decades. A third contained a handwritten note. In the margin, Mark's eyes narrowed. He read it silently. Then he looked toward me. Not toward Karen. Not toward the crowd. Toward me. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I think we need to visit that engineer today." Mark's suggestion changed the mood immediately. The crowd had spent hours looking backward through records. Now there was suddenly a person who might connect every missing piece. The bridge stood silent above the creek as if waiting for the answer to. Sunlight flashed across the steel frame. Wind moved through the trees lining the banks. Karen said nothing. That alone drew attention. Earlier she had challenged every document, every survey, every question. Now she stood beside the open binder watching events move without her. The older resident broke the silence first. "Can we contact him?" Mark nodded. "I already did." Several people looked surprised. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded note. "When I found his name in the archive references, I called before coming here." A small wave of anticipation moved through the crowd. "Did he answer?" someone asked. Mark smiled faintly. "Yes." That single word seemed louder than the traffic waiting behind us. Even Karen looked up. Mark continued. He remembered the bridge immediately. The contractor near the railing let out a low whistle. The creek rushed beneath us. A delivery truck driver stepped out of his cab and walked closer. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Mark unfolded the note. His name is Harold Bennett, 81 years old, retired structural engineer. Several residents quietly repeated the name. Mark glanced at the paper again. When I mentioned the bridge, he asked one question before anything else. A natural pause settled over the crowd. Minnie Hook. Everyone leaned in. "What was the question?" the woman near the school bus asked. Mark looked directly at me. He asked whether ownership had finally been resolved. The reaction was immediate. Conversations erupted around us. People exchanged looks. The older resident shook his head slowly. Finally, the word carried weight. It implied duration. Years. Decades. Not a recent misunderstanding. Something old. Something known. Karen stared at the creek. Her expression revealed nothing, but her silence revealed plenty. Mark folded the note again. Then he told me something else. The crowd quieted once more. Wind rattled through the bridge trusses overhead. The familiar metallic hum drifted across the water. Mark lowered his voice slightly. He said there should be a project archive. I felt my attention sharpen immediately. "Where?" I asked. "In his storage building." Several residents laughed softly from disbelief. An entire morning of county records, surveys, correspondence, and missing reports had led to a storage building 30 miles away. Yet somehow it felt completely believable. Harold Bennett belonged to a generation that kept paper copies of everything. Mark nodded. He said he never throws engineering records away. The contractor smiled. "That sounds like every engineer I have ever met." A few people laughed. The tension eased for only a moment. Then reality returned. If that archive existed, it could answer questions no one else could. It could confirm who knew what. It could reveal what happened to the transfer documents. It could explain the missing inspections. Karen finally stepped forward. Those files would be unofficial. Her voice sounded controlled again. She was trying to regain ground. Mark did not argue. Perhaps. Then he shrugged. But they are still records. Several residents nodded immediately. The balance had shifted. Facts mattered more than titles now. I looked at my watch. Nearly noon. What began as a locked gate had become a full-scale investigation. School buses had rerouted. Deliveries had been delayed. Residents were calling employers. Yet almost nobody left. That fact stayed with me. People sensed they were watching something important unfold. Then my phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. Area code from the neighboring county. I answered. The voice on the other end sounded older. Calm. Direct. "Mr. Walker?" "Yes." A brief pause followed. Then the man spoke. "This is Harold Bennett. I think I still have the original bridge file." The voice on the phone sounded steady and certain. Around me, the crowd immediately noticed the change in my expression. Conversations faded. The creek continued flowing beneath the bridge, but now even that sound seemed distant. "Mr. Bennett," I said, stepping slightly away from the truck hood. "You still have the files?" A soft chuckle came through the speaker. Son, I kept every file. Several residents smiled when I repeated his answer. Even Mark looked relieved. For the first time all day, we were moving toward answers instead of questions. Harold continued speaking. The bridge project filled 3 storage cabinets. I never trusted the county to keep complete records. That statement drew immediate reactions from the people closest to me. Mark folded his arms and listened carefully. Harold's voice remained calm. There were ownership discussions from the beginning. Another important detail. Another missing piece sliding into place. I glanced toward Karen. She was listening now, very closely. Can you meet today? I asked. Harold answered without hesitation. I already pulled the files. The crowd reacted before I could. Several residents exchanged surprised looks. The older man who had followed every development since morning smiled for the first time. Harold continued. I suspected someone would eventually come asking. Wind moved through the bridge trusses overhead. Sunlight reflected across the creek. The entire scene felt different now. The uncertainty was shrinking. There is something else, Harold said. His tone changed slightly. A natural mini-hook settled into the conversation. What? I asked. A brief pause followed. Then he answered. The final ownership recommendation was written. I remember that clearly. My grip tightened around the phone. Nearby residents immediately noticed. Mark stepped closer. Karen looked away toward the trees. Harold continued. Whether it was followed is another question. That sentence spread through the crowd within seconds. People repeated it quietly to each other. Whether it was followed, not whether it existed, not whether it had been discussed. Followed. That distinction mattered. Mark nodded slowly as he listened. The contractor near the bridge railing muttered something under his breath and shook his head. Years of confusion suddenly seemed less accidental. Harold gave me an address outside a small rural town about 30 miles away. Then he added one final comment before ending the call. Bring a camera. You are going to want copies. The line disconnected. Silence followed. Dozens of residents stared at me, waiting for an update. I lowered the phone. He has the files. The reaction was immediate. Relief. Curiosity. Excitement. People began talking all at once. Karen remained silent. Mark asked the next question. Can we leave now? I nodded. We can. The older resident raised his hand. Would you share whatever you find? Absolutely, I said. Several people thanked me. That surprised me more than anything else. Earlier that morning, many residents viewed me as the reason access had been restricted. Now they viewed me as the person searching for answers. The shift had happened gradually. One document at a time. One question at a time. Karen finally stepped forward. Those files may not prove anything. Her voice sounded quieter now. Not confrontational. Defensive. Mark responded calmly. Then we will find that out. Nobody argued with him. The school bus driver checked his watch. Delivery drivers returned to their vehicles. Yet many residents remained. They wanted updates. They wanted closure. They wanted to understand how a bridge they crossed every day had become the center of a decades-old mystery. I looked once more at the structure stretching across the creek. The steel beams glowed beneath the afternoon sun. The bridge looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Yet everything about it had changed. Ownership questions. Missing inspections. Archive correspondence. Unresolved recommendations. None of it was visible from the roadway. But it was there, hidden beneath years of assumptions. Mark gathered the documents and closed the archive folder. Karen quietly picked up her binder. The crowd slowly began dispersing. Then, just before we left, the older resident walked over and handed me a folded piece of paper. You should see this before meeting Harold, he said. I looked down at the folded paper in my hand while the crowd slowly dispersed around. The bridge. The afternoon sun sat lower now. Long shadows stretched across the gravel road. Engine started. Doors closed. Conversations drifted away. Yet something about the paper felt important. The older resident waited until most people had moved away before speaking again. I found it in my garage last year. His voice was quiet. Never thought it mattered. That immediately caught my attention. Mini hook. I unfolded the paper carefully. The edges were worn. The fold lines looked decades old. Mark stepped beside me. Karen paused several yards away near her vehicle. She pretended not to watch. She failed. The paper contained a photocopy of a meeting notice. A very old one. A date near the top placed it almost 19 years earlier. Below the heading sat a list of agenda items. Most were routine. Landscaping. Budget reviews. Entrance signage. Then one line stopped me cold. Bridge ownership transfer discussion. Mark saw it at the same moment. Interesting, he said quietly. The older resident nodded. My wife attended that meeting. Wind moved through the pine trees beside the creek. The bridge hummed softly overhead. Everything seemed to slow down. I scanned the rest of the page. A handwritten note appeared in the margin. The ink had faded, but several words remained readable. Transfer postponed, pending documentation review. Mark looked up immediately. That matches the archive references. Another piece connected. Another missing gap narrowed. The older resident pointed toward the note. My wife used to write on everything. His expression softened briefly at the memory. Then he looked toward Karen's vehicle. She always said that meeting ended strangely. Mark raised an eyebrow. How? The older resident shrugged. According to her, nobody seemed willing to make a final decision. The contractor who had remained behind overheard the conversation and walked closer. So everyone knew there was a question? The older resident nodded slowly. That is what it sounds like. The realization settled heavily over the group. For years, residents had operated under assumptions. Yet evidence kept appearing that key people knew uncertainty existed from the beginning. Karen opened her driver's side door, but did not get inside. She remained standing there, listening, watching, calculating. Mark checked his watch. We should leave soon. He was right. Harold Bennett was waiting. The project archive was waiting. Potential answers were waiting. Yet before we could move, another resident approached carrying a small cardboard box. You might want these too. Everyone stared. Even Mark looked surprised. The resident set the box on the hood of the truck. Dust coated the sides. Inside sat old newsletters from the early years of the neighborhood. Meeting announcements. Community updates. Maintenance notices. Mark flipped through several copies. Then he stopped. A highlighted article occupied half a page. The headline mentioned infrastructure planning. Beneath it sat a paragraph discussing future responsibility reviews for the access route crossing the creek. No final conclusion. No ownership confirmation. Just another reference suggesting the question remained unresolved. The contractor shook his head slowly. This keeps getting worse. Nobody disagreed. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. Year after year. Document after document. Concern after concern. Questions raised. Questions postponed. Questions never fully answered. The creek continued rushing beneath the bridge. The structure itself remained unchanged. Yet the story surrounding it looked completely different now. Mark closed the box and loaded it into his truck. Harold is going to want to see these. The older resident smiled faintly. Tell him good luck finding a clean answer. That comment lingered longer than expected. Good luck finding a clean answer. It felt less like a joke and more like a warning. I looked toward the road leading away from the bridge. 30 miles separated us from Harold Bennett and his storage building full of forgotten records. The afternoon sunlight reflected across my windshield as I opened the truck door. Then my phone buzzed again with a message from an unknown number. The attachment contained only one photograph. The message arrived just as I opened the truck door. An unknown number. No name. No explanation. Only a single photograph. Attached. I tapped the image and stared at the screen. For a moment, I did not understand what I was seeing. Then everything snapped into focus. The photograph showed a conference table. Several people sat around it. Coffee cups, folders, meeting packets, ordinary details. But the date stamp in the corner caught my attention immediately. 11 years ago. My pulse quickened. Mark stepped beside me. What is it? Without answering, I turned the screen toward him. His eyes narrowed. Then he looked up at me. Where did you get this? The photograph contained something none of us expected. At the center of the table sat a large engineering drawing. The bridge. There was no doubt. The same steel truss design. The same dimensions. The same creek crossing. Yet, that was not the important part. The important part sat directly beside it. A document folder labeled Ownership Resolution Proposal. Mark stared for several seconds. Around us, the last few residents noticed our reaction and walked closer again. The older resident adjusted his glasses. What happened? I zoomed in on the image. Several faces became clearer. One belonged to the original developer. Another matched a county official from the archive records. A third face appeared partially turned away from the camera. Yet Mark recognized him immediately. Harold, the retired engineer, had been at the meeting. The crowd became silent. Wind brushed through the pine trees. Water rushed beneath the bridge. The entire day suddenly seemed to narrow toward one conclusion. There had been a proposal. There had been a meeting. There had been an attempt to resolve ownership. The question was no longer whether people knew. The question was what happened afterward. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. This time there was text. Only one sentence. Ask Harold about the blue folder. Mark read it twice. Then a third time. The older resident frowned. Blue folder. Nobody had an answer. Not yet. I looked toward the road stretching away from the bridge. The afternoon sun hung low now. We were running out of daylight. Mark closed the archive box and loaded the remaining documents into his truck. We need to go. Nobody argued. Even Karen remained silent. She stood beside her vehicle watching everything unfold. The confidence she carried that morning was gone. In its place sat uncertainty. Maybe concern. Maybe realization. Before leaving, I walked to the center of the bridge one final time. The steel beneath my boots felt solid. The creek reflected gold sunlight between the supports. Traffic remained restricted. The inspection order remained active. The ownership question remained unresolved. Yet for the first time all day, I felt close to an answer. Not because of assumptions. Not because of opinions. Because of evidence. Real evidence. Survey records. Archive files. Meeting notes. Engineering recommendations. Forgotten correspondence. One piece at a time, the story had emerged from beneath years of silence. The bridge had never been the real mystery. The real mystery was why so many people avoided resolving its status. I looked back toward the neighborhood entrance. Residents were still standing there in small groups, discussing what they had learned. Questions remained, but the conversation had changed. The bridge was no longer invisible infrastructure. It was something they understood mattered. Something worth asking about. Something worth protecting. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. Mark pulled out behind me. Together we headed toward Harold Bennett's address and the storage building waiting beyond the county line. Somewhere inside that archive sat the final answers. And if the photograph was telling the truth, they might all be inside a blue folder.